Hi everyone, for today's lesson, we are going to learn about the properties of squares. Our learning targets for today are for you to be able to say, I can identify and apply the properties of a square to solve problems. So a square is the last and the most bottom piece of our quadrilateral chart. It's the very last figure. It's connected to all of the other ones that we've talked about so far. That means that it has all of the properties of parallelogram or of quadrilaterals, meaning all of the angles are going to add to 360. It'll have all of the properties of a parallelogram, but it's also connected to a rectangle and a rhombus. So what I'm referring to is our chart right here. The last picture that we're going to be talking about is a square, and a square is connected to a rectangle and a rhombus. That means that a square has all of the properties of a rectangle and a rhombus. And because rectangles and rhombuses are connected to parallelograms, that means that a square has all of the properties of a parallelogram. So anytime there exists a connection, that means that whatever came before, those properties go down into all of the other shapes. So awkwardly, it's like rectangle and rhombus had a baby and they called it square. So that is like a fun little way that my students and I in the past have always talked about what a square is. For today's lesson, you are going to need the cutouts for squares. So please make sure that you have that cut out. You're going to need a glue stick. You're going to need something to write with, and you'll need colors. So if you wouldn't mind making sure that you have all of these supplies before you get started for today, that would be very helpful. The first thing that we are going to do is I would like you guys to please go ahead and paste this box directly into our notebook, and we're going to paste the square right here on the side. So let me go ahead and get started by pasting this box directly into our notebook. And I'm going to paste the square directly onto this piece of paper. Now, a square is a parallelogram. It is a parallelogram that we also call a regular quadrilateral. Now, a regular figure, we've talked about those before. And a regular quadrilateral means that it has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So we call that a regular quadrilateral because when you have 4 congruent sides, this means that it is equilateral. And 4 right angles, which means that all of the angles are congruent, making it equiangular. And when a figure is both equilateral and equiangular, we call it regular. Regular means that it's both equilateral and equiangular. So it is considered a regular quadrilateral. A square is a parallelogram, which means that it's going to have all of the properties of a parallelogram plus extras. Notice that the extras are also, it has 4 congruent sides and it has 4 congruent angles. So it's a quadrilateral is a square if it is both a rectangle and a rhombus. So I know that we've talked about how rectangles are parallelograms, rhombuses are parallelograms, and squares are parallelograms. But I want you guys to make the connection. All squares are rectangles because all squares have 4 right angles, just like a rectangle does. But it has extra properties beyond what a rectangle has. And I want you to know all squares are rhombuses. And that's because a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. So that means that this square, like all squares are rhombuses that have 4 congruent sides, but it has extra properties. Just like as we've gone down the chart, we've had to add extra properties. So what we're going to do is we're going to list all of the properties of a square, starting with parallelogram. So the first thing that we know about a square, before maybe I write everything down, is that it has 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. So let's go ahead and mark that up because this is a square that we are talking about. It has 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. So far I have marked up what I know about a square so far. But talking about the properties of a parallelogram, we know that opposite sides are parallel. So I'm going to mark up on my picture my symbol for parallelogram or for parallel. So that's going to be 2 arrows and an arrow and an arrow. So the arrows always match each other. So this is parallel. Next, we know that opposite sides are congruent. And that's exactly what we see here. We see opposite sides being congruent. Not only are opposite sides congruent, all sides are congruent, but just viewing it from the lens of properties of parallelograms, yes, it is true. Opposite sides are congruent. Opposite sides are congruent. Next, we know that opposite angles are congruent. And that is true. Opposite angles are indeed congruent. We have a 90-degree angle, and 90-degree angles are congruent to each other. 90-degree angle, 90-degree angle. These opposite angles are congruent to each other. So yes, those opposite angles are congruent to each other. Four, consecutive interior angles are supplementary, which means that they're going to add to 180. So consecutive interior angles are angles that are next door neighbors. And I have a little phrase, next door neighbors, say what's up. They are supplementary with each other. All the way around the figure. They are sup. All of these are supplementary. That means that they're going to add to 180 degrees. And finally, number 5. So this is just for parallelograms. We know that the diagonals bisect each other. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in the diagonals using my straight edge. As long as you have like the side of a notebook, or if you just want to eyeball it, that's fine. But you want to draw in the diagonals. Let me do a better job. I didn't do a very good job. There we go. We'll focus on that one. And this one. So the diagonals are supposed to bisect each other. So let me go ahead and verify that. So this diagonal length appears to be about 9 centimeters, and at 4.5, that's where the point of intersection is. So same thing over here. It appears that this is the length of 9 with about 4.5 being at the point of intersection. So they do indeed bisect each other. So that is an absolute truth. Yes, they do bisect each other. So that is true. But more so, they are congruent to each other. And now we're going to talk about the properties of rectangles and rhombuses. So what I've just talked about so far, these are all of the properties of parallelograms. So I'm going to write on the side, parallelograms. And these are all of the properties that come from parallelograms. All of the ones that we've talked about all day in all of the lessons for parallelograms, rectangles, rhombuses, and now finally squares. But like I said to you guys before, a square has all of the properties of rectangles as well. So a rectangle has all of the properties of parallelograms plus a couple of extras. So those extras were 4 right angles. So because it has 4 right angles, that makes it a rectangle. So I'm going to write that down, which I guess we already had that marked up here. So we have 4 right angles, which we already have that marked, plus the extra one is that the diagonals are congruent to each other. But we also have 4 right angles. And that came from rectangles. So this one right here is strictly rectangles. The next property, which is the extra property that comes from rhombuses. So we already know that rhombuses have all sides that are congruent, but the extra one that comes from a rhombus is that the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So we really need to write down this one just a little bit more. So if it bisects the opposite angles, that means that each side of the angle has been cut in half. And if this is 90 degrees, if all of the full angles are 90 degrees, half of 90 is 45. So all of these angles are going to be 45 degrees. All the way around. There's nothing more to think about, which is really nice. Half of 90 is 45, so the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So I want to mark that up. The diagonals bisect the opposite angles. Not to mention there does exist 4 congruent sides, so I want to make sure I write that down. They got the 4 congruent sides from rhombuses. So they got the 4 congruent angles from rectangles, 4 congruent sides from rhombuses. But our last one is that the diagonals are perpendicular. So not only do the diagonals bisect each other that came from parallelograms, but these couple extra came from rhombuses. And that is that the diagonals are perpendicular. So they will intersect to form right angles. So there exists right angles going all the way around. So we have 4 right angles all the way around each side. And this is everything that you need to know about squares. So once again, it has all of the properties of parallelograms. Opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive interior angles are supplementary, diagonals bisect each other, but we also have diagonals are congruent to each other. There's 4 right angles, so that means all angles are congruent. The diagonals bisect the opposite angles, so that means that all of the little pieces are going to be 45-degree angles, with every single one of these triangles being a congruent triangle. And look at there, they are congruent right isosceles triangles. So that's something that's really cool. And then the diagonals are perpendicular. So there exists a couple of statements that I want to make sure that I write down for you guys before we end this lesson. And the first one is every square is a rectangle, rhombus, and parallelogram. Every square is that. So when you ask, is a square a rectangle? The answer is yes. And that's because it has 4 right angles. Is a square a rhombus? Yes, every time. And that's because a square has all sides that are congruent. Is a square a parallelogram? Yes, because it has all of the properties of a parallelogram. The next thing I want to write down is that a rectangle is always a parallelogram. But sometimes it is a rhombus or square. So it is sometimes. So think about it. Does there exist a rectangle, which a rectangle is a parallelogram that has 4 right angles? Does there exist a shape that has 4 right angles and all of the sides being congruent? The answer is yes, of course. Well, that means that it's a rhombus because that rectangle has 4 sides that are congruent, now putting it into the category of rhombus. And if you have something that it has 4 right angles and it has 4 sides that are congruent, then it is automatically a square. The third statement that I would like you guys to please write down is that a parallelogram is sometimes a rectangle, rhombus, or square. Sometimes it is, but every parallelogram is not going to be a rectangle, rhombus, or square. It'll be its own shape. So those are some statements that I really want to make sure you guys know and study. Be prepared for questions like that on your quizzes and homework. That is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions over squares, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.